Hello, this is Myra Elaine on the Buying Space channel. I'm reading from the Torah. On this side is the Hebrew. On this side is the English, translated directly from the Hebrew. I am in chapter 4 of Exodus, and I'm at the end of chapter 4 in Exodus. And I have to say that I feel like every few verses need to be read and talked about because there is so much going on in this last part of chapter 4 that I think it's too much for one video, even though it's verses 18 to 31. I've read entire chapters with 31 verses in it in one reading, but there's just too much here. So I'm going to start in 18. And this is after Moses saw the burning bush and talked to God. So, and Moses went and returned to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, "Let me go, I pray thee, to return to my brethren that are in Egypt, and see whether they be yet alive." And Jethro said to Moses, "Go in peace." And the Lord had said unto Moses in Midian, "Go, return unto Egypt, for all the men who sought thy life are dead." And Moses took his wife and sons, and set upon an ass, and returned to the land of Egypt. And Moses took the staff of God in his hand. And the Lord said unto Moses, "When thou goest to return to Egypt, regard well all the wonders which I have put in thy hand, and do them before Pharaoh. But I will harden his heart, and he will not let thy people go. And thou shalt say to Pharaoh, Thus hath said the Lord, my son, my firstborn is Israel. And I said unto thee, Let my son go, that he may serve me, and thou refusest to let him go. So behold, I will slay thy son, thy firstborn. And I'm going to stop there. And I only read 18 to 23. And the reason I'm stopping there is because God was instructing Moses. He was preparing him on his journey back to Egypt, back home. He had lived in exile all these years, married, had his own life, but when it was time, when the people that put him in exile were all dead or out of power, it was time for him to return. There was a different Pharaoh now. He still chose to enslave the people of Israel. He was continuing to enslave the Hebrews. Once the other Pharaoh had died, the slaves were hopeful that maybe the next Pharaoh would treat them better and not enslave them or not work them as hard or, take a more human approach to them. And he did not. And prayers went up to God. God heard the people cry out. Like, oh God, this is going to continue. Because, you ever work a job and you get a new manager and you're really hopeful that the new manager is going to be a lot nicer. And sometimes they are. And sometimes they aren't. And sometimes they're worse. And you're like, oh my gosh, can I have the old manager back? this is what happened. Everything continued as it was, and everything was already harsh. You're kind of hopeful, and then your hopes are crushed. And then, it's whatever you were going through before, realizing that it's going to continue. It makes it worse. But also, Moses himself, when he was exiled, when he was traveling from Egypt to Midian, he changed as a human being. He developed, he matured. When he was in Egypt, he was the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He probably had servants. He was in a household with servants, most certainly, and he most certainly received a good Egyptian education. And he learned about all kinds of history and the gods, and I don't know how much construction he would have been taught, or architecture, the pyramids. I mean, just a tremendous amount of knowledge would have been passed to him by instructors. He would have been surrounded by scribes and priests and all kinds of people that were doing crafts. Just a very enriched, privileged life. I don't know if he had personal servants or not, but definitely his household would have been run by servants. Or not run by servants, but full of servants. So when he traveled to Midian, by the time he got there, he was willing to draw water for those 7 sisters at the well. He had been humbled by his journey. He no longer had luxury in his life. He was surviving crossing the desert. So he was happy to be a simple shepherd. By the time he got there, he was happy to have a life and a family. And on his journey home, all those experiences he had as a child and the knowledge of who he was coming to full fruition in the desert, traveling with his wife and his sons back to his home, thinking about his mother and his father and his siblings. And we don't know how much he knew about his Hebrew family. He knew about Aaron. I'd say he knew about Miriam. But other than that, we don't really know how much he knew. He knew he was Hebrew when he killed the Egyptian that had slayed a Hebrew. But when did he find out? Did his mother tell him before he went to Pharaoh's daughter's household to live, to be an adoptive son? Did he know that? Did he keep it secret? Did the people in the Pharaoh's daughter's household tell him that he was Hebrew? Or did they treat him like an Egyptian until a certain point in time that the secret came out? People that are adopted don't always know. Maybe he knew because his skin color was a little different. They all would have been people of color, but maybe his skin was a little different. Maybe he was more Aramaic looking than African looking. We don't know if there was a distinct physical difference, so he knew from the beginning, or if he was told the week before he murdered the Egyptian that murdered the Hebrew. We don't know. So I'm sure on his way back, he was overwhelmed with all these thoughts flooding back to him about his old life in Egypt and the people that were there, and God's calling for him to free his people. Certainly, being raised in an Egyptian household, he would have thought big, because the family of the Pharaoh were to build pyramids and prepare for the afterlife in a grandiose way, and to build cities and to tear down things and build things up and make huge statues and edicts and sculptures, all of that would have been put upon and trained in the children in the household. That this is, you're going to do these grand things. These grand things are going to happen around Pharaoh. So Moses was raised to think big. The rest of us, the common people, think about getting jobs, having a life, getting married, those normal things. But we don't think about building a city or building a pyramid or, storing up grain for 7 years for the entire world or society like Joseph, like Joseph did. All of those grandiose things most people don't think about doing, but he was raised thinking about doing those grandiose things and being a leader. He wasn't ever going to be Pharaoh, but he was a member of Pharaoh's household. So he was around that leadership training, let's say, his entire childhood. So how do you think that framed Moses? It did frame him to have the mindset to be a leader because he was around it. So as he's returning, he's thinking, how am I going to be accepted as leader among my people to free them? He'd seen the behavior in Pharaoh. He'd been around him. He had direct exposure to that level of leadership. So how is he going to, after being a shepherd, the husband of the priest's daughter in Midian, how is he going to be a leader? Of course, I'm sure his father-in-law was a local leader, but we're not talking about leading a nation. His father-in-law was a local leader, spiritual leader, but the shepherds would, run over his daughters to get to the well first. So it wasn't like, Pharaoh-like leadership, but it was leadership spiritually in that local community. So he'd been exposed to good examples and bad examples of leadership, or grandiose examples of leadership. So he's got all this running through his mind, all of these things, and all that Egypt is in returning to it. Imagine he was more than a little intimidated by the prospects of telling Pharaoh he needed to let his slave force go, that he needed to build the pyramids and make sculptures and do all those things Egypt accomplished. That is daunting. I know God calls us ordinary people to fill leadership roles and to teach. But this was quite the calling. But Moses was quite the man. But he had lessons to learn on his way to Midian and the way back from Midian to Egypt. And we'll cover that starting in verse 24 next week.